We have carried out a preliminary or a feasibility survey, which was moderately encouraging, and thanks to the generosity of many individuals and concerns, we have the necessary finance.
This is Jack Hayward. He has provided the Great Britain project with enough money to bring the ship home.
Well, I first saw it in the press. I think it was the Times. I think it was a letter to the Times. I think all these things started with letters to the Times, all these crusades. Then they ran a leader article on it, that it should be saved. Then I spoke to Dr. David Owen, who was associated with Lundy, the saving of Lundy Island, and he also was involved, or at least had given his blessing to the project to bring back the Great Britain as Under Secretary of State for the Navy. And that's when I was introduced to Mr. Richard Gould Adams and Dr. Ewan Corlett, and from that moment onwards it was sort of all systems go, I think.
The next step is a detailed technical survey, including a salvage survey and formulation of plans in detail for the floating, repair and tow home.
By pure chance, the dry dock in which she was built still existed, lying virtually unused in Bristol. The Wapping dock was the perfect place for the Great Britain to come back to, if they could bring her, and if the new dock gate had still enough width for her to pass through. This template was built to exactly the same shape as the widest part of the ship's hull. Dr. Corlett watched as they got the template into exactly the right place and measured the space.
12.5 inches. That's right.
Less than a foot, but enough. She was still a wreck in the Falklands, but the plans to save her were beginning to work out. It had become pretty obvious that towing the Great Britain right across the Atlantic was going to require some very large and very modern equipment. In March this year, a strange convoy crossed the Atlantic and dropped anchor in Sparrow Cove, right alongside the Great Britain. Towed by an ocean-going tug, the Mulus is a floating pontoon of 2,500 tons. To understand their plan is simple. To see how they could carry it out is quite another matter. The plan was to put the Great Britain on top of the Mulus and tow them both back to Britain as one complete unit. And to do that, they had two separate teams of men. Leslie O'Neill was in charge of floating the Great Britain, also responsible for all the pumps and gear sent out to repair the hull and get it off the beach. Horse Cowlin was in charge of the pontoon, and incidentally it was his job to lower the great spar still remaining, and also the three enormous wooden masts. It is hard to appreciate just how big these masts are until you see the size of a man in relation to them. In fact, they're the biggest wooden masts ever built. They had to cut the yard away with an oxyacetylene torch because the metal parts holding it up had rusted solid. Now this spar weighs over 8 tons. It's 105 feet long, and if they made a mistake and it dropped, the whole project would be over, because it would cut the ship virtually in half. While the spar came gently down, and while they prepared to lift out the masts, it was time for the divers to get under her stern and start patching the holes made when she was beached in 1937. From inside, it looks a fairly impossible task. But they used a very simple system. They cut sheets of ordinary plywood so that they would fit and overlap the holes. These sheets were drilled and bolted through to clamps attached on the inside of the ship. Of course, plywood isn't strong enough on its own, But once in place, it's no very great problem to cover the whole area and bury the holes with a patch made out of good, strong concrete. The plan worked well, and within a matter of hours, where the sea had been surging in and out, the hull was completely watertight. This part, at any rate. The sheer legs were up and attached, and they were ready to start lifting. Take into account that the step of a mast like this is placed well down inside the ship, and a lot of mast has to be lifted out before they can swing it clear and over the side. They had refurbished that deck house themselves as somewhere comfortable to eat their breakfast. That was only the small mizzenmast, and that might easily have been a lot worse if somebody had been in the way. The mainmast, probably the biggest wooden mast in the world, weighs 30 tons. Horst decided that discretion was the better part of getting home in one piece, and gave orders for a chainsaw to be obtained and the mast cut off just above the level of the deck. They attached the hoist, and then with just enough lift on the winches to hold it upright, they began to cut away the metal stays. They were hoping for just enough wind to blow it in the right direction. Of course, when they wanted it, the wind died, and the mast stayed resolutely upright. So they hammered in wedges instead. Two down and one to go. The Great Britain was built with 6 masts. During her career, she lost 3 of them in 40 years, finishing up as a 3-masted ship. Now she was to lose her other 3 masts in less than a week. With the hull now lighter by many tons, the job of getting the ship afloat became a good deal easier. Nevertheless, the prospect of putting one of these 2 giant objects on top of the other still looked like a formidable task. The system basically required that the Great Britain should float while the Mulus should sink. Then with the Great Britain exactly over the top of the Mulus, they could refloat the pontoon. Only to do it, the Great Britain had to float, and to achieve that, they had to close the crack. They used a system as old as Trafalgar, and probably a lot older than that. With plywood put across the face of the crack, they lowered mattresses into the water, hauled them down, and stuffed them, one after the other, into the open space. Now you may wonder why they didn't use concrete like they did with the holes in the stern. But the crack is different. If the ship floats, instead of lying on an uneven bed of sand and rock, she'll be supported evenly all the way along. The gap should close and the mattresses will be trapped, making a watertight joint. They were now getting nearer the critical stage. These great steel plates were measured, cut and fixed into the structure of the ship across the split. The idea being that when she floats and the gap closes, they can tighten up the bolts and hold her together so